So as we are still reeling in shock and grief from the events of October 7th, the aftermath, the explosion of anti-Israel hatred, and then anti-Semitism, we're watching in great shock and dismay what I call the double attacks on our senses of self, which were the attacks on October 7th, the atrocities, the brutality. I'm going to say relatively small expression, but remember, because of media, the smallest expression can achieve gargantuan proportions. People who are the purveyors of hatred know well how to use the media to their advantage. And of course, the greatest example of this is Goebbels, who was under Hitler. He knew how to use the media, how to stage events, how to capture the passions of people, engage in these public rituals of hatred, power, and bellicosity, and the will to war that swept people up into it. Many people don't know, and I think this is historically true. After the beginning of the war against the Soviet Union in June 1941, as far as I know, the mass protests began to stop when the casualty lists came back. And certainly after the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, with the eradication of the Nazi Sixth Army, the mass movement, in a way, ended, and it was simply a country in a war that they knew they were going to lose. But I want to talk tonight because I think many of us are aching to understand, how did support of Hamas, an overtly terrorist, atrocity-committing organization with a medieval theocratic point of view that is completely contrary to the modern mind, completely contrary, for example, to our values of truth, reason, ethics, and right, and got swept up in something that is, just to do the political list, no sense of human rights, right to vote, anti-woman, anti-gay, certainly deep sense of bigotry and racism, and they've captured the imagination of much of the American intelligentsia, and clearly much of the intelligentsia at so-called elite universities. So many of us want to ask ourselves, how could this have possibly happened? So we have many explanations. No explanation is an exhaustive explanation, but I want to bring up a few explanations so that we understand what happened and that we understand what we have to do. And one of them is Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer. Now, he wrote the book in 1951, trying to understand how, in particular, the Nazis and the communists were able to draw some of the best and brightest minds in their countries and fuel them in an ideology that, upon examination, could not be defended. I don't know how many of you read Herman Wouk's 2-volume book, A War and Remembrance. I read it as a teenager, and there's a scene where when the protagonist is an American Jew who, because he's fluent in German, joins the army as an intelligence officer, arrives in Germany after the war, and he's interviewing Nazis. So he's super physically fit, very, very fine officer. He lets it know soon in the interview that he's a Jew, which astonishes the Nazis because they still have their stereotypical idea of the Jew. And then he asks the Nazi to please explain their point of view. And he says, I'm just going to ask questions. And there would always be a point in the interview when the Nazi would break down into incoherence. That once they were actually in a discussion where they couldn't yell, couldn't threaten, and was in a dialogue, and they knew that this dialogue might have an effect on the rest of their lives. And when the officer said, make a case, I want to understand you, none of them can do it. And so the question is, why do people join movements that if you got them alone and tried to have a conversation, that they could not start to prevaricate, they could not start to adduce things that are actually not true? You got your smartphone out, go along the whole way. Why do people join such things? Why do people stop thinking? Why do people join hatred? So Hoffer talks about this book, that these mass movements oftentimes begin with a certain group of people that he uses the metaphor that their lives are spoiled. that they see there's a trajectory towards success in their society, but they're not part of it. So they have a spoiled inner identity. They're disgruntled. They don't think that they've been part of where the society is going. So oftentimes these mass movements begin in a society that is upwardly mobile, but they've been left out. So there's a sense of mass discontent. Now, with this discontent, then someone comes along with an ideology. And the ideology explains the discontent. And Hoffer says, they don't have to have a God, but they have to have a devil. They have to blame someone, something that accounts for their suffering, meaning an object of hatred. And then he notices many things about these mass movements, and one is, of course, the theatrical side of it, the idea of the public demonstrations. And as you'll see tomorrow, these public demonstrations almost have a kind of a sense of a religious revival. People gather not just to demonstrate against some policy of the government, but there's some kind of exhilaration in the participation. And oftentimes these movements exhaust themselves, but sometimes they can burrow in and survive for decades. So what we're seeing here is a form of a mass movement. Now, in the Islamic world, of course, the mass movement, and again, I'm using it advisedly. When Israel, for example, was formed and they said, tiny little Israel with 600,000 people against 100 million Arabs, they weren't against 100 million Arabs. 100 million Arabs never showed up. What showed up was the small, ill-trained professional armies of the countries round about, but they were mostly trained to prevent a coup, not as an expeditionary force. So the full power of the Arab world was never brought against Israel. They thought that the professional armies of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and other volunteer forces, including the Arab Liberation Army in Palestine, that they would easily deal with the Jews. Once Israel stood on its feet, as you remember from last week, that was originally the meaning of the word Nakba. Nakba did not, the catastrophe, the reversal, that now is directed toward Israel. When the word was first used, according to people that I've read in 1956, Nakba referred to the war fever of nations that were unprepared for war, attacked a small nation, but had actually prepared for war and resulted in a disaster. So the word was initially used as self-delusion, a kind of a national suicide of interest, and only later became directed toward the Jews when the original meaning was directed toward Arab leadership. Now, once it's directed toward the Jews, then we have the beginning of a mass movement, upon examination, could not hold up. So, for example, let me share with you, when I began to investigate the so-called liberation theory, certainly with the North Vietnamese Liberation Army, then the Vietnam War, and I wanted to understand these things. I was brought up on the left, what I'm going to call the political left, meaning civil rights-oriented, fair shake for the working person, civil rights, etc. Although my parents were former communists, they had just simply become very strong Democrats. But I really want to understand all of this. And when I would quiz liberation theory, even back in those days, in the late 60s and early 70s, it was not hard to find it. And here's what I found. That from a liberation movement theory, all colonists, by their presence in the other country, were performing an act of aggression, therefore had no human rights, and may be murdered and ought to be murdered. I tried to examine that. Somebody's part of France, United States, they go over to Vietnam, they're setting up a business, they're trying to bring some wealth, prosperity, and goods to the country, and they get blown up. And you say, for what purpose? Because they're invaders, because they're colonists. And I remember, I was a little bit young for the anti-war generation. I wasn't 18 until 1973. But people say they were anti-war. This did not ingratiate me with the anti-war protesters. I said, are you against the Viet Cong waging war? Are you against North Vietnam waging war? Are you against the Soviet Union helping the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese? So they actually weren't anti-war. They're anti-American. So whenever a person says anti-war, what you'll find out with just a couple of questions, they're actually not anti-war. They're anti-United States, anti-the West, anti-Israel. So, for example, I remember when the Cambodian genocide began, 1975. I queried many of my people that I knew in the anti-war movement. I said, why aren't you breaking out in protest against the Cambodian genocide when I heard you before breaking out in protest because you felt sorry for the genocide against the Vietnamese? Why aren't you out there? And they mumbled some kind of an answer, but I knew what it was. You can't hate Cambodians. You can hate America. You can hate the West. So they weren't really anti-genocide. They weren't really anti-deaths of innocent people in Indochina. They weren't actually against war. They were only against the United States, and by extension, Israel, and in some sense, the West in general. You saw this in the great almost revolution of 1968 that couldn't go anywhere because protesters who tried to bring down Western society in 1968, they had no alternative. They couldn't make a case to people. They demonstrated, they rioted, but there wasn't any follow-up. So why do people do it? Why are kids in college campuses suddenly joining these protests? From what Eric Hoffer says, people have, as I spoke about last week a little bit, there's an inner vacancy of meaning. One of the problems with political liberalism, meaning our regime, human rights, constitutional government, regulated free market, there's no passion in that. And so one thing that happens in what I'm going to call a liberal political setting, and by liberal I mean from Democrat liberal to Republican conservative, it's all liberal in the classic sense of a constitutional government, representative government, separation of powers, a regime of human rights, and regulated free trade. That more or less describes what I'm going to call political liberalism. The problem is there's always going to be winners and losers. There are going to be people that, despite clearly the great opportunities, there are people that don't find themselves able to take advantage of the opportunities. So Hoffer points out that many people are criminals. He puts sinners in scare quotes, ne'er-do-wells, the bored, but people who don't seem to be able to take advantage of what the political liberal regime promises to offer, which is not prosperity and equality, but equality of opportunity and equality before the law. So I think about these college students. They come out of, I'm going to say, our homes. You know, our, let's say, middle class and upper middle class Jewish homes, if that's most of us here. They don't grow up in homes of meaning. If they do grow up in homes of meaning, and this is based on lots of research that I've done, oftentimes the meaning is articulated in despair ever since Trump was president. Despair about the climate, despair about Trump, that the world is falling apart, the world is irredeemable. It's never been this bad, people would say to me. I would say 1862 was a bad year, 1942 was a bad year. Compared to world history, this is actually not a bad year. But people actually said to me, it's never been worse. And I would say, could you demonstrate that? And of course they couldn't because it was a feeling. So now try to imagine, and by the way, there's been research done, families where there's constant despair about the climate, the world's going to burn, there's nothing we can do to change it. And America has gone to rot. Everything is useless. Everything is meaningless. Try to imagine that person now going to college and asking themselves what they're doing there. For what purpose? To join in what I'm going to call the middle class guinea pig mill, the middle class rat race through the maze? What are they looking forward to? A traditional sense of, what a person can look forward to as they go through their 20s, I think, first of all, is lifetime love. Ideally, doesn't work out, obviously. It works out sometimes the second time around. But maybe I'll meet someone who will love me and value me. Maybe I'll find meaningful work. Maybe I'll do something that will consume my creative interest. And now you're brought into a world where you've been told the world is meaningless and spoiled. Contrary to what Hoffer said, not that the person has a spoiled identity, but a spoiled identity because they live in a spoiled world. Now, this is ripe for a mass movement, meaning a large number of people, all brought together in a university setting, for example, really with a kind of perpetual ennui. The famous French sociologist Durkheim, at the turn of the century, when he was trying to understand why suicide went up in France when people moved from villages to cities. And he was the first person to not look at the personal motivations for suicide, but rather suicide as a sociological phenomenon. And he said, it doesn't really matter why each person commits suicide when they would investigate, but the phenomenon of suicide in France in urban environments. And what he wrote was, and he's a great sociologist, still worth reading, was when people moved to the cities and thought about the job in the factory and the wealth that they would encounter, and they weren't ready for the deplorable conditions and the bad working conditions and conditions in the city, and they didn't have the village to hold them together. Many didn't feel that they could go back to the village as a wreck, as ruined, as someone who couldn't succeed. And the other option was to kill themselves. So this kind of despair, life does not produce enough meaning. I can't produce enough meaning, and there's no mass movement to join. So many of you probably know that one of the countries with the highest suicide rate in the world is Japan. Now, in many ways, you could not look for a more equitable modern society, but if you look at Japanese sociology, there's no, as it were, movement of meaning in Japan. It's the same thing in South Korea, by the way, where there is a lack of meaning. Many people ask, how did Protestant Christianity take such hold in South Korea? Partly because it's a movement for meaning. Now, so try to imagine, here we are, the undergraduate whose basic philosophy, utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number, no one can figure that out, there's no obligation to do it anyway. They go to another class, it's all critical studies, everything is the patriarchy, God is an idea foisted on people by right-wing religious people to manipulate and control everybody, but especially women and minorities. So everywhere they go, everything is spoiled. There's no God, there's no meaning, there's no morality. There's some kind of group of elites that are spoiling everything and operating behind the scenes to eviscerate society. It's a culture of complaint. It's a culture of somebody else is doing something to ruin my life. This is an essential part of critical theory, by the way, that I want to talk about tomorrow a little bit. And suddenly a movement of meaning shows up. And there's theater. And there's chance. And there's a moment for a person that Hoffer says people actually renunciate, they renounce their own identity, their own capacity for reason, their own deepest held values. And they want to join in the protest. They want to join in the movement. There is a devil. The price of joining is abdication of reason, abdication of facts. So many people ask, why can't I have a factual conversation with one of these people who are in this state, assuming that there's an oppressor everywhere, but we can never get there factually? Because, as I'll talk about more tomorrow, it is a kind of a religion. So one reason we can't talk to them, one reason we can't reason with them, is the mass movement itself forbids reasoning with anybody. It's either obedience, it's identifying with the values, identifying with the goals, with the slogans, and if you go off of that, you are kicked out of the tribe, you're kicked out of the herd. Now, for me, that is one of the most unfortunate consequences of our political environment. I believe the only tribe I have, ultimately, is the tribe of people committed to truth and ethics. That's my only tribe. So if I meet a person of, let's say, a member of the tribe, let's say of the Jewish people, but they're not committed to truth and ethics rigorously, they're actually not in my tribe. If I meet an atheist, a Muslim, a Christian, anybody else whose life is ultimately committed to truth and ethics, they're in my tribe. And part of what truth means is you can handle the truth. We can have a conversation, and if you detect some kind of incoherence in my point of view, please point it out, because I want to be a person of truth. And if I detect something in yours, I'd like to be able to say something. Now, what I've had most of my life is when I detect an incoherence and I point it out, people really get agitated. Because if they agree with the facts, if they agree with a coherent theory, they've lost their tribal identity. This isn't really a mass movement, but in a sense, it's identifying with a way of thinking that forbids a certain kind of reasoning because you'll lose your identity. And that's what I realized with many people. They would shut down during a discussion, out of fear of losing their identity if they began to think differently. So one thing about these mass movements, and I'll say mass movement-like, is the adherence to dogma. So when we're looking what happens and why people would suddenly take up the cause of Palestine, ask yourself, is there another cause? We went through Black Lives Matter, and I shared with you. I mean, I have great personal commitment and sympathy for the Black experience in America. You know, people say some of my best friends were Black. All of my best friends were Black. I grew up in Compton, and they were willing to put down their life for me. And I saw what was happening. My best friends in the military. I think I told the story when I moved off base. I moved into an apartment. It was Finley and 4 Black guys. And the kind of racist white guys on my base was like, what are you doing? I said, they're cool. I like Black people, man. What am I going to do? Right? It was home for me. That's where I grew up. So, you know, I think I'm one of these people that just has, you know, a true commitment to the improving the conditions of one racial minority, one, I'll say marginalized group of people for whatever reason. But when I went to the Black Lives Matter website, it was Marxian. It was filled with hatred of the West, hatred of the family, suspicion of Western culture, the eradication of the liberal political state, and hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism. Now, I saw the website before they took it down and put up another website. So I looked at this and I realized, look at the power of the slogan. So people said to me, what about Black Lives Matter? I said, smaller case, absolutely. Larger case, it's not what you think. My assessment is when you look at all the effects of Black Lives Matter, all the money they got, were there any social programs? Were there any educational programs? Were there summer camps that focused in people learning how to study? It was really the politics of demonstration and discontent. I'm not saying that's not, you know, I'm an American. People can demonstrate all they want. I wish they wouldn't destroy private property. I think that's criminal, but put that aside. But I realized the allure was Americans were looking for meaning, especially in the age of, I'm going to say the age of Trump, where, you know, some kind of politics of resentment clearly built up. In a way, it was a pushback, this is my opinion, of an older American identity, which is the civil rights movement. So it was a pushback against it's fairly described, by the way, as a mass, again, putting this in square quotes, the mass movement of the Trump phenomenon. Now, one reason we know this is, apparently in Hillary Clinton's reflections on the election of 2016, she asked all of her senior staff to read True Believer. She said, if we're going to understand this political opponent, you all have to read Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. It is one of the most reprinted books and translated books in the modern world, especially with something with such a dense topic as the social psychology of mass movements. So one thing that we're facing is the cause of Palestine, the cause of Hamas, of all organizations, has captured the imagination of those in search for a mass movement. So it's not that they believed in it and then joined the mass movement. They joined the mass movement and then asked what they needed to believe. And that's something very indicative of mass movements. First is I need the group. I need the solidarity. I need the demonstrations. I need the chants. I need to renunciate my own identity. I need to turn my identity over to the group. Now tell me what I have to believe. Now, the question is, in my mind, as we look at this, how enduring will this be? Clearly, great damage has been done to Jewish sensibility. I think sensibilities of Americans who are committed to truth, ethics, and reason. This has been a rough moment for all of us when it was happened to our college campuses. And I as I said, I'm going to devote the rest of my life to the resurgence of what I think is a God-inspired idea, the best possible regime under which human beings can live, which is the liberal political order of representative government, separation of powers, regime of human rights, and regulated free market. It's more deep than that, but I can't think of anything better than that. Why people would abandon that for a terrorist organization committed to perpetual war, atrocities, and murder. Now, I hope the minute this happened, I understood it because because of my background in social theory and social psychology and Hoffer and many others, I knew exactly what was happening. They were joining a mass movement. They didn't care what they believed. passion, the theatrics, is part of what draws it. I don't think this is going to last. I think this war is going to be over at some point. There's going to be a ceasefire because it's going to get resolved in some way. And no, people are going to get bored with the details. It's just going to be a thing of the past. What we're going to have to figure out is how we can make our children, those whom we know, immune from mass movements, which means help provide them lives of meaning. And that, I think that's one thing that we really haven't focused on. Many people have said to their children, for example, you choose your religion when you grow up. I don't know. Greatest good for the greatest number. I don't know if God exists. Like, they look at their parents. They don't stand for anything oftentimes. And if they stand for something, oftentimes it's a culture of despair and complaint. I hope I'm not offending anybody here. It's the studies that I've read that are trying to account for the widespread teenage depression, the widespread pathology of teenagers. Of course, COVID has an effect, but other things have an effect as well. So again, my goal here, as we move away from the atrocities of October 7th, and there's a war to be had. I hope the war is conducted successfully. We're going to get the hostages back. I hope Hamas is eradicated. We, like much of the Arab world, aside from Iran, don't want Hamas to be an actor in the Middle East because all they spread is poison, murder, and terrorism. From what I've read, Arab governments don't want that kind of a destabilizing power in their world. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do for the rest of our lives to provide young people, especially, with lives of meaning and purpose? So when a mass movement arrives that says we're going to murder people, we're going to commit genocide, we're going to lie, we're going to distort the factual record, we don't care about reason, that when such a mass movement arrives, our children will be incredulous and say, you actually want me to support something that has no factual basis, does not believe in human rights, does not believe in representative government, does not believe in protecting the marginal, and is committed to genocide and murder. And you want me to join your group? Try to imagine if someone put it to them like that. I've seen little videos where people have said, do you support Hamas? Yes. Okay, do you support human rights? Yes. Well, okay, so that's not here. Do you support elections? Okay, they don't have elections. Do you support an imposed religion? They go on the checklist of what Hamas actually is. Nobody agrees with what Hamas is. One of the answers to the mystery is the allure of mass movements. Now, so the last thing I want to say today is if we're going to provide lives of meaning for the people that we know, we have to have lives of meaning. Meaning, in my mind, and I'm passionate about this thing called political liberalism. I mean, it doesn't sound the kind of thing you should be passionate about, but I'm passionate about it. I really believe deeply in constitutional representative government. I really believe people have the right to choose their government. I really believe that people factually, metaphysically have human rights. I really believe that people get to trade with each other with a minimum interference of other people. If I make something, you and I can make a trade, and we don't need someone else looking over our shoulder and telling us that we can't do it, within reason. So I believe this is true. I believe, like our founders, I believe this is actually a godly idea. And sometimes when I get passionate about it, people used to call me, not nowadays, by the way, they used to call me jingoistic. You sound like a right-wing patriot. I said, I'm just a patriot because I believe in this system deeply and it's the best thing for all humankind. But nobody gets passionate about it. Now, I don't know how to make people passionate about political theory, but I'm going to try to make a case for it. My class coming up on Tuesday nights, I really want to make a case that we should be passionate about this and speak about it with passion and conviction. So when I'm thinking of our metaphorical children, when we talk about it, people will say, wow, mom, dad, parent, aunt, uncle, they really mean it. One of the greatest compliments I've been given as a rabbi. And that is, people would say to me, I don't agree with a lot of what you say, but I know you've thought about it and you mean it. You mean what you say. You've thought about it. Maybe you came to the wrong conclusion. but you can reason about it. You can stand someone who disagrees with you. You can walk through it, not dogmatic. I mean, I had so many conflicts with people who disagree with me because I'm passionate about truth and I'm passionate about ethics and all these other things. So I want to communicate to all of us here. Live with lives of passion for your values, to the point that people are awed by your passion. They're awed by the depth of your values. When you walk in the room, you stand for something. And someone looks at you and says, I want to be like that person. I want to have that degree of depth. I want to have that degree of thoughtfulness. I want to have that degree of conviction for my beliefs. We need to be walking models of passion for what is good, just, right, and true. So, eventually I'll speak about this less and less, but as I think about what we believe about about Oratora, and one phrase we've come up is wisdom in formation. In fact, we put that on an email we sent around advertising my talks for tonight. Wisdom in formation. That, for me, I think is our deepest identity. We stand for the formation of wisdom, and it's always in formation. We're always forming it. We're never dogmatic. We're never rigid. But there is something called wisdom for which we stand, and I think everybody here stands as well.